The Greyhound bus pulled into the downtown Asheville station on a scorching summer afternoon, and the doors hissed open like the last breath of something mechanical and tired. Ethan Mercer stepped down onto the pavement military rucksack slung over one shoulder. White army tank top stretched tight across a muscular frame, faded cargo pants, bloused into worn combat boots, with soles ground nearly flat. 3 years. Not a single phone call home. Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't remember where home was. He had just crossed the sidewalk when a woman standing beneath a storefront awning looked straight into his eyes, stepped forward, and whispered in a trembling voice, "You don't remember me, do you?" Ethan stared at her. A complete stranger, but his heart hammered against his ribs as though his body remembered something his mind had lost. He studied her face for another second, dark hair pulled back, steady eyes rimmed with something raw, hands clasped tight in front of her like she was holding herself together. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with effort, and everything to do with pain. But Ethan had bigger things to deal with than a stranger who claimed to know him. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice flat and polite, the voice of a man who had learned to be courteous in places where courtesy kept you alive. "I don't think we've met." The woman pressed her lips together, her eyes reddened, but she nodded calmly and turned away. Ethan watched her go. Her hands were shaking. He noticed that, filed it somewhere in the back of his skull, and kept walking. The house was a 15-minute walk from the station, a small place on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, white siding, a narrow front porch, a mailbox with the name Mercer still stenciled on the side in faded black letters. He and Sarah had bought it the year before his last deployment. It was supposed to be the place where they'd raise Noah, plant a garden, grow old in the kind of slow, unremarkable way that soldiers dream about in foxholes. The key was still in his rucksack. It still fit the lock. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell hit him first: stale air, dust, the faint ghost of cleaning products that had evaporated months ago. Mail was piled beneath the door slot, envelopes yellowed and curling. Every surface wore a thin coat of gray. He walked through the living room, past the kitchen, and stopped at the doorway of the small bedroom at the end of the hall. Noah's room. The toddler bed was gone. The dresser was gone. But the dinosaur stickers were still on the wall. A T-Rex, a Triceratops, a row of little green diplodocuses marching toward the window. Whoever had packed up the room hadn't bothered to scrape them off. On the kitchen counter, beneath a ceramic mug that had gathered a ring of dust, sat a manila envelope. Inside, divorce papers. Filed and signed unilaterally 14 months earlier. Sarah's handwriting on a yellow sticky note attached to the first page. "I waited as long as I could." "I'm sorry." Ethan lowered himself to the kitchen floor, his rucksack still strapped to his back, and held the papers in both hands. He didn't cry. He didn't break anything. He just sat there, legs stretched out on the linoleum, staring at the signature of the woman he'd married in a courthouse 9 years ago. The silence in the house was total. It was the silence of a man who had become so accustomed to loss that he no longer knew how to react to it. The knock came 20 minutes later. Ethan opened the front door and found Frank Mercer standing on the porch, 67 years old, ex-Marine, Vietnam veteran, still built like a man who could throw a punch if the situation required it. A neighbor had called him. Frank looked at his son. Ethan looked at his father. Neither of them moved. Neither reached out. Frank just nodded once, slowly, and said, "Come on, let's get you something to eat." That was how Mercer men said "I love you." At Frank's kitchen table, over reheated pot roast and black coffee, Ethan asked about Sarah and Noah. Frank told him what he knew. Sarah had waited 2 years, first with hope, then with desperation, then with the kind of grief that eats a person from the inside. The Army had listed Ethan as missing in action. Then they found him, unconscious in a military hospital in Germany. No identification, no memory. It took nearly another year to confirm his identity and transfer him to Walter Reed. During that time, Sarah fell apart. She took Noah and moved to Raleigh to live with her mother. "She's not a bad woman, son," Frank said quietly, turning his coffee mug in his hands. "She just broke." Ethan stared at the table. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were steady. "Where's my boy?" he asked. The next morning, Ethan walked through town. Asheville looked familiar in pieces, a storefront here, a street corner there, but large sections of his memory were missing, like a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces swept off the table. He recognized the hardware store on Haywood Street. He didn't recognize the brewery next to it. He walked past a park where he was fairly sure he'd once pushed a stroller, but the image wouldn't hold. He stopped at the barber shop on Lexington Avenue. The owner, a heavy-set man named Dale with a white mustache and reading glasses on a chain, looked up from his chair and went still. Then his face crumpled. He crossed the room and grabbed Ethan's hand with both of his own. "We thought you were dead, Mercer." Ethan gave him a tired half-smile. "Almost." That afternoon, he called Sarah. The conversation was short and strained. She cried, but there was steel underneath the tears. "You disappeared for 3 years, Ethan. 3 years. Noah doesn't even remember your face." Ethan wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. He had crossed minefields in Helmand Province. He had carried wounded men through alleys choked with smoke, but he couldn't find a single sentence to say to the woman who had once been his wife. Sarah told him she wouldn't prevent him from seeing Noah, but she needed time. And a lawyer. Ethan hung up and squeezed the phone until his knuckles turned white. Later that day, he walked into a coffee shop on Biltmore Avenue for a black coffee, the one old habit his fractured memory had somehow preserved. The shop was small, warm, filled with the hiss of the espresso machine and the murmur of afternoon conversation. He ordered at the counter and turned to leave. Claire Dawson was sitting at a corner table. She had a laptop open in front of her, a notebook beside it, a pen in her hand. She was writing something when she looked up and their eyes met. Ethan stopped. He was surprised to realize he had been thinking about her since yesterday, not because of how she looked, but because of the way she had looked at him, like he was someone who mattered and didn't know it. He walked over. "Yesterday," he said. "You weren't wrong, were you?" Claire set down her pen. Her expression shifted surprise, then something careful, something guarded. "I know who you were," she said slowly. 7 years ago, in Kandahar." The word hit him like a flashbang. Kandahar. Something surged in his chest, not a memory, not a picture, but a sensation. The smell of hot dust, the distant percussion of an explosion, the weight of something heavy across his shoulders. But no image, no face, no scene, just feeling, raw and unattached. He sat down across from her, Claire told him. She had been a young war correspondent, 27 years old, embedded with a press convoy in southern Afghanistan. The convoy was ambushed. She was hit by shrapnel in the leg and buried under collapsed masonry. Everyone pulled out. Everyone except one soldier who turned around and went back in. "You carried me 200 meters through rubble," she said, her voice quiet and steady, though her hands were gripping the edge of the table. "And then you went back for someone else. That's the last thing I saw before the explosion." Ethan looked down at his right forearm at the long, jagged scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow. He had never been able to explain that scar. The doctors at Walter Reed told him it was consistent with blast debris. He traced the raised line of tissue with his thumb. For the first time since stepping off that bus, he wanted to remember. But right now, he needed to find his son first. He drove to Raleigh on a Thursday morning in Frank's old pickup truck, a faded blue Chevy with 200,000 miles on the odometer and a rattle in the exhaust that Frank refused to fix on principle. The drive was 4 hours. Ethan spent every minute of it rehearsing what he would say to his son. He tried a dozen versions. None of them sounded right. There was no script for reuniting with a 7-year-old boy who had spent more than half his life without a father. Sarah was waiting on the front porch of her mother's house, a tidy brick ranch in a suburb east of downtown. She was thinner than he remembered, with dark circles under her eyes and a set to her jaw that hadn't been there before. She didn't hug him. She didn't argue. She just looked at him with an expression that was equal parts relief and exhaustion and said, "He's inside. Don't push him." Ethan nodded and walked through the front door. Noah was sitting on the living room floor, cross-legged, building something out of Lego bricks. He was small for 7, with sandy hair and a narrow face. Ethan knelt down a few steps away. His throat was tight. His hands were trembling in a way they never had under fire. "Hey, buddy," he said. "It's Dad." Noah looked up. His eyes pale blue, the exact same shade as Ethan's were blank. No recognition. No warmth. Just the careful, watchful gaze of a child sizing up a stranger. He glanced at his mother, standing in the hallway, then looked back at Ethan, then returned to his Lego bricks without a word. Ethan had been trained for combat. He had been trained for explosions, for ambushes, for the deafening chaos of a firefight in close quarters. He had been trained to endure pain, to push through fear, to keep moving when every nerve in his body screamed at him to stop. But no one had trained him for this, for the moment when his own child looked at him the way you look at a repairman or a neighbor you've never spoken to. It was the deepest wound he had ever received, and it came without a sound. Sarah appeared in the doorway behind him. She leaned against the frame and spoke quietly. "The first year you were gone, he asked about you every single day. Where's Daddy? When's Daddy coming home?" The second year, it was less, maybe once a week. By the third year, he stopped asking. She paused. "He didn't forget you, Ethan. He just stopped waiting." Ethan stayed for 2 hours. He didn't push. He didn't try to force a hug or a conversation. He just sat on the floor beside his son and handed him Lego pieces when he needed them. A red one, a gray one, a tiny, translucent blue that Noah placed carefully on top of what appeared to be a spaceship. They didn't talk. The only sound was the click of plastic. Just before Ethan stood to leave, Noah said something without looking up. "My mom said you were a soldier." "Yeah," Ethan said. "I was. Did you win?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm still trying." Noah didn't respond, but he reached for another Lego piece, and for a fraction of a second, his small hand brushed against Ethan's fingers. It could have been an accident. Ethan chose to believe it wasn't. He made it as far as the outskirts of Asheville before he had to pull over. He gripped the steering wheel with both hands and lowered his forehead against it. And then he cried hard, broken, shaking for the first time since he'd stepped off that Greyhound bus. Not for the war, not for the memory he'd lost, for the boy on the living room floor who didn't know his father's face. That night, he sent Claire a text message, just one line. "You said I saved you. I can't even save my own son." She didn't reply, but 20 minutes later, there was a knock at Frank's front door. Claire stood on the porch holding a paper bag of takeout food. She didn't say anything except, "You need to eat." Frank made the appointment. Ethan didn't argue. The VA clinic on Tunnel Road had a waiting room that smelled like floor wax and instant coffee, and a psychologist named Dr. Linda Pace, who wore no-nonsense glasses and spoke with the calm authority of someone who had heard 1,000 war stories and still believed in the people telling them. Ethan sat across from her in a vinyl chair and told her everything. The deployment. The TBI. The 3 years lost in hospitals. The son who didn't recognize him. The woman at the bus stop who claimed he had saved her life. Dr. Pace listened without interrupting. When he was finished, she leaned forward slightly. Traumatic brain injury can erase episodic memory, the specific events, the details, the faces, but it often leaves emotional memory intact. Your body stores what your mind can't access. She studied him. That's why the woman at the bus stop felt familiar. Your brain didn't know her, but something in you did. The dream started that week. Not nightmares, exactly fragments, a sound of screaming, the grit of sand between his teeth, a hand gripping his forearm so hard the nails broke the skin, the smell of cordite and burning metal. He woke on Frank's sofa, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, grasping at images that dissolved like smoke the moment he opened his eyes. He started working. A plumbing company on Riverside Drive, run by a man named Gary Holt, a retired Navy petty officer with a shaved head and a handshake that could crack a walnut. Gary looked at Ethan's blank resume, looked at his calloused hands, and said, "You start Monday. No questions. No paperwork beyond the essentials. Just one veteran recognizing another." Ethan began rebuilding his life from zero. He woke at 5, worked until 5, ate dinner at Frank's table, and fell asleep on the sofa watching the 11 o'clock news. It was the kind of routine that held a person together the way duct tape holds a cracked pipe functional, but not permanent. On Saturday, he met Claire at a park near the river. She had asked to see him. She wanted to tell him more about that night in Kandahar. The press convoy had been traveling from the forward operating base to a village south of the city for a scheduled interview with local officials. They were hit 2 kilometers outside the wire. An IED detonated under the lead vehicle, and then small arms fire from both sides of the road. Claire's vehicle took a direct RPG hit. She was thrown clear but caught shrapnel in her left leg. A wall collapsed on top of her. She was pinned, bleeding, and conscious. "I screamed for help for 20 minutes, she said. They were sitting on a bench by the water, and her voice was flat the way people speak when they've rehearsed a memory so many times it no longer belongs to them. Everyone pulled back. I could hear the order to withdraw, and then I heard boots on gravel. One person, coming toward me, not away." She turned to look at him. "You said 4 words." "I got you, ma'am." Ethan didn't remember. He searched for it, dug through the wreckage of his memory like a man searching through rubble. Nothing. But something in his chest tightened, something that felt less like remembering and more like instinct, like the words had been carved into his bones rather than stored in his brain. Frank noticed the change in his son. Ethan was quieter than before, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there when he stepped off the bus, a kind of light, faint but steady, like a pilot flame that might catch. That evening, sitting on the front porch with 2 beers between them, Frank said, "When I came back from Vietnam, your mother waited. Not everyone gets that, son. But you got something else. You got a second chance. Don't waste it on what's gone. Build what's next." That weekend, Ethan mailed a postcard to Raleigh. Not a letter. Not a long explanation. Just a picture of the Blue Ridge Mountains with 5 words on the back. "Thinking of you, buddy. Dad." It was simple. It was patient. It was the way a soldier fights a long war, one small, deliberate action at a time. Dan Holloway lived in a 1-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a walk-up in northeast Charlotte. The hallway smelled like cigarette smoke and old carpet. Ethan knocked 3 times before the door opened. Dan looked worse than Ethan expected. He had put on weight in the wrong places and lost it in others. His eyes were red-rimmed, his beard untrimmed, and there were 2 empty bottles of bourbon on the kitchen counter behind him. He stared at Ethan for a long moment, and then his face crumpled like wet paper. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, "you're really here." They sat at the kitchen table. Dan poured himself a glass and offered one to Ethan, who declined. For the first 20 minutes, they talked about nothing: old barracks, bad food, a sergeant named Kowalski who once got his boot stuck in a drainage ditch during a live exercise. They laughed a little. But the laughter was thin, and beneath it, both of them knew why Ethan had come. "Tell me about Kandahar," Ethan said. Dan's hand tightened around his glass. He stared at the table, and then, slowly, like a dam cracking, it came out. He had been driving the armored vehicle at the rear of the convoy. When the IED hit the lead truck and the gunfire started, The convoy commander ordered an immediate withdrawal. Standard protocol: pull back, regroup, call in air support. Dan wanted to turn around. He wanted to go back for the press vehicles that were still taking fire. But he froze. His foot stayed on the accelerator, and he drove out of the kill zone with the rest of the convoy. Ethan didn't. Ethan dismounted, grabbed his rifle, and went back in on foot. Alone. "You pulled the reporter out first," Dan said, his voice breaking. "The woman. She was pinned under a wall. You dug her out with your bare hands. Then you went back for Fareed, the interpreter. He was in the second vehicle, still conscious but trapped." Dan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "You got them both out. You were carrying Fareed toward the rally point when the second IED went off. It threw you 15 meters. I saw it from the rearview mirror." Dan had turned his vehicle around then. He drove back into the kill zone, loaded Ethan's unconscious body into the back, and brought him out. The medics kept Ethan alive long enough to get him on a helicopter to Bagram, then Germany. "I should have gone in with you," Dan said. He was crying openly now, his shoulders shaking. "I froze, Ethan. I was a goddamn coward. And when you woke up and didn't remember, I thought maybe that's better. Maybe you don't need to know what I did. What I didn't do." Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You pulled me out, Dan. You drove back into it, and you pulled me out. That's not a coward." Dan shook his head, but he didn't argue. He just sat there, his hand trembling around his glass. Then he said something else. "There's more. After you got shipped stateside, a reporter tried to reach you. She wanted to write about what happened that night. Your commanding officer shut it down, said it would complicate an ongoing investigation into the ambush." Ethan frowned. "What investigation? The ambush wasn't random, Ethan. Somebody leaked the convoy route. That's what they were looking into. Military intelligence thought the route was compromised through a private security contractor that was handling logistics for the press vehicles." The room went quiet. Ethan sat with that for a long time, his jaw clenched, his mind turning over the implications like a man examining a grenade with the pin half pulled. 400 miles away, in a small bedroom in Raleigh, a 7-year-old boy placed a postcard on his desk, a picture of mountains with 5 handwritten words on the back. He didn't say anything about it to his mother. He didn't stick it on the fridge or show it to his friends. He just set it on the corner of his desk, propped against the lamp, where he could see it every morning when he woke up. Sarah noticed. She didn't take it down. Ethan told Claire everything Dan had said. They were sitting at the same corner table in the coffee shop on Biltmore Avenue, the place that was quietly becoming theirs without either of them naming it. Claire listened with her hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. When he finished, she was silent for a full minute. Then she told him the rest. After the ambush, after the surgeries, after the months of physical therapy that gave her back the use of her left leg, Claire had tried to write the story. She was 28 years old, and she had nearly died, and the only reason she hadn't was because a stranger in combat boots had turned around and walked back into hell for her. She wanted to know why the ambush had happened. She wanted accountability. Her editor killed the story. "Not enough sourcing," he said. "Too politically sensitive. The military wasn't cooperating. The private contractor, a company called Ridgeline Defense Solutions, had lawyers who sent letters." Claire pushed back. Her editor pushed harder. She was told, in a tone that left no room for interpretation, to let it go. She left war reporting after that, came back to the States, took a job at a regional paper, and spent the next several years writing about city council corruption and school board budgets. But the story never left her. She kept every document, every email, every classified summary she'd managed to obtain through sources who trusted her. "I didn't come to Asheville just to say thank you," Claire said. She looked him in the eyes. "I'm writing the story again. I've been gathering evidence for years, and I need you, Ethan, because you're the only living witness besides me who was inside that kill zone." Ethan leaned back in his chair. Something cold settled in his chest. So you didn't come here just for me, you came for a story. The words landed hard, and Claire flinched. I came for both, she said, and there was a crack in her voice that she didn't try to hide. You saved my life. That matters to me more than any article ever will. But 2 men died in that ambush. And someone needs to be held accountable for what almost killed you. They sat in silence. The coffee shop hummed around them. After a while, Ethan nodded, not agreement, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. He stood up and left without another word. That night, the dream came clearer than it ever had. He was running, dust in his eyes, his lungs burning, his hands torn and bleeding. And then he saw a face young, female, coated in dust and blood, eyes wide with terror, one hand reaching toward him. The mouth was moving. Don't leave me. He knelt down. He put his arms around her. He said something, and then the world went white. He woke, gasping. And for the first time, he recognized the face in the dream. It was Claire. The phone rang the next evening. It was Sarah. Her voice was different, softer, less guarded. He asked about you today, she said, first time in a year. He asked if you're still a soldier. Ethan gripped the phone. Tell him I'm a plumber now, but I'm still fighting. There was a pause. Then Sarah said, He wants to see you again. This Saturday. Ethan closed his eyes. The kitchen went blurry. I'll be there, he managed. Claire was sitting on the porch steps of Frank's house when Ethan came outside after the call. She had come to return a book Frank had lent her. She and the old man had developed an unlikely friendship over coffee and crossword puzzles. She looked up at Ethan and saw something she hadn't seen before. He was smiling, not the careful, controlled half-smile he usually wore. A real smile, raw and unguarded, the kind that cracks open a face that has been clenched shut for too long. And in that moment, sitting on those wooden steps in the fading light, Claire realized something she hadn't been prepared for. She wasn't here just because of the article. She wasn't here just because of gratitude. She was here because of him, not the soldier who had saved her 7 years ago, but the father who was fighting his way back to his son right in front of her. 2 threads ran side by side that week, braided together like the cables of a bridge. The first was the truth. Claire spread the evidence across Frank's dining table on a Tuesday evening, while Ethan sat across from her and Frank stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. She had years of material military after-action reports with entire paragraphs redacted in black, operational logs with entries deleted, and a leaked internal email from a mid-level logistics officer at Ridgeline Defense Solutions. The email, dated 3 days before the ambush, showed that the press convoy route had been shared with a local subcontractor who had no security clearance and no vetting. The subcontractor's communications were later found to have been intercepted by insurgent operatives. It wasn't treason. It wasn't a soldier selling out his brothers. It was something almost worse, corporate negligence dressed up as cost efficiency. A private military contractor cutting corners on operational security to save money, and 2 American soldiers paying for it with their lives. Ethan read the document slowly. His hands were steady, but a muscle in his jaw was twitching. He didn't remember the night of the ambush. He couldn't picture the road, or the explosion, or the 2 men who had died. But he remembered their names: Corporal James Jimmy Haynes, 24, from Tulsa, Oklahoma; Specialist David Reeves, 22, from outside of Pittsburgh. He remembered their faces from photographs he'd seen. He remembered their laughter from a part of his brain that the IED hadn't been able to reach. I don't need to remember that night to know what it cost, he said quietly. I lost 2 brothers. I lost 3 years of my son's life, and some company made money off it. He told Claire to publish it. The second thread was Noah. On Saturday, Ethan drove to Raleigh with a new Lego set on the passenger seat, a military helicopter, 214 pieces. He found Noah in the same spot on the living room floor. This time, he didn't announce himself. He just sat down, opened the box, and spread the pieces between them. They built in silence. For an hour, the only sound was the quiet click of plastic locking into plastic. Ethan sorted the pieces by color. Noah followed the instruction booklet with the focus of a surgeon. Twice, Noah reached across Ethan's knee to grab a piece, and each time Ethan held his breath and kept perfectly still, the way you do when a bird lands on your hand and you don't want to scare it away. Then Noah spoke. "I got your postcard." "Yeah?" Ethan said, keeping his voice steady. "Asheville looks cool." "It is. Maybe you can visit sometime." Noah didn't answer, but a few minutes later, without any announcement, he leaned sideways and rested his head against Ethan's arm. It wasn't a hug. It wasn't dramatic. It was the quietest gesture in the world, a child tipping slightly toward his father, like a plant turning toward light it hadn't felt in a long time. Ethan didn't move. He barely breathed. Sarah stood in the kitchen doorway, watching through the gap in the wall. She pressed her hand to her mouth and turned away. For the first time in 3 years, her son looked like a child, not like a boy carrying a wound too large for his body. On the drive home, Ethan called Claire. His voice was rough but steady. "I think my boy is coming back to me." There was a pause on the other end. Then Claire said softly, "He never left, Ethan. He was just waiting for you to come home." Ethan drove the rest of the way in silence, with the windows down and the summer air streaming through the cab, and he didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. That was exactly what he'd needed to hear. The article went live on a Wednesday morning. Claire published it through the Asheville Citizen-Times with a regional syndication deal that put it in front of readers across the Carolinas and beyond. The headline was "Restrained, Leaked Route, Lost Lives: How a Defense Contractor's Negligence Led to a Deadly Ambush in Kandahar," but the content was devastating. Names, dates, internal communications, a timeline of institutional failure stretching from a boardroom in Virginia to a dirt road in southern Afghanistan. The response was immediate. Veterans organizations shared the article by the thousands. 2 congressional offices requested briefings. The Department of Defense opened a formal review. Ridgeline Defense Solutions issued a terse statement denying wrongdoing, which only made the story travel faster. Ethan refused every interview request. Reporters called Frank's house, left messages at the plumbing company, showed up at the coffee shop on Biltmore. Ethan said the same thing to all of them. "I'm not a hero. Talk to the families." He didn't want the spotlight. He wanted to go to work, come home, and see his son on the weekends. That was enough. But the spotlight found him anyway in a way he hadn't expected. A woman named Patricia Haynes called on a Thursday evening. She was 71 years old and she lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Her son was Corporal Jimmy Haynes, one of the 2 soldiers killed in the ambush. She had read Claire's article. She had seen Ethan's name. And she had one thing she wanted to say. "I just wanted to hear the voice of the man who tried to save my boy." Ethan sat on the edge of Frank's sofa with the phone pressed to his ear and cried. Not quietly. Not the restrained, controlled grief of a soldier maintaining composure. He wept openly, his shoulders heaving, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Because this was different. The tears he'd shed on the highway after seeing Noah were tears of loss. These were tears of being seen, of someone reaching across the miles and the years and say, quote, "What you did mattered." And in that moment, Ethan understood something he hadn't been able to name. He didn't need to remember everything to be whole. Memory could be stolen. Time could be lost. But the man, he was the man who turned around when everyone else kept running. That man was still there. The IED hadn't taken that. Nothing could. Sarah called 2 days later. Her voice was different again, quieter, rawer, stripped of the armor she'd been wearing since the day he showed up on her mother's porch. She had read the article. "I didn't know, Ethan," she said. "I didn't know what happened to you over there. They told me MIA. They told me to prepare for the worst. I thought." She stopped. "You did what you had to do," Ethan said. "I don't blame you. I never did." There was a long silence. It was the sound of two people laying down weapons they had been carrying for 3 years, not to reconcile, not to rebuild what had been, but to forgive, to finally let each other go without bitterness. Then Sarah said, "Noah can come stay with you for 2 weeks this summer. In Asheville." A pause. "He asks about you every day now. He still has that postcard on his desk." Ethan held the phone against his chest for a moment after she hung up. He closed his eyes. This time, the pressure behind his eyelids wasn't grief, it was hope. Claire came by that evening. She sat on the porch steps and told him she was sorry for pulling him into the public eye, for making his private pain part of a headline. Ethan looked at her and shook his head. "Don't apologize," he said. "You gave me something no doctor ever could. You showed me who I was when I couldn't remember." From inside the house, through the screen door, Frank watched the two of them sitting on the steps in the last of the daylight. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, raised it slightly toward the window, and smiled. It was the first time he'd smiled like that in a very long time. 2 months later, summer had fully arrived in Asheville. The mountains were dark green, the air smelled like honeysuckle and warm asphalt, and the evenings stretched long and golden like something out of a painting. Noah came on a Saturday. Sarah drove him up from Raleigh, and when the car pulled into the driveway of the small house Ethan had cleaned and repaired and furnished with a second-hand bed for his son's room, complete with new dinosaur stickers on the wall, because some things deserve a second life. Noah climbed out of the back seat with a backpack over one shoulder and stood there looking up at the house with wide, uncertain eyes. "This is where you live?" he asked. "This is where we live," Ethan said. "When you're here." The first few days were careful. Noah was polite but guarded, the way children are when they're testing the ground beneath them. But Ethan was patient. He had learned patience in foxholes and in hospital beds and in the long, quiet months of a life rebuilt from nothing. He taught Noah how to tighten a pipe fitting. He took him fishing on the French Broad River with Frank, who showed the boy how to bait a hook and told him stories about the mountains that may or may not have been true. In the evenings, Ethan told Noah about the things he remembered from when Noah was small, the way he used to fall asleep clutching a stuffed elephant, the time he laughed so hard at a cartoon that milk came out of his nose. Noah listened to these stories the way travelers listen to news from a country they used to live in, with longing and distance and a fragile kind of hope. One evening, after dinner, Noah looked at his father from across the kitchen table and asked, "Dad, why did you go away?" Ethan set down his fork. He got out of his chair, walked around the table, and knelt so that his eyes were level with his son's. "I went because I thought I was protecting people," he said. "And then I got hurt, and I couldn't find my way home. But I'm home now. And I'm not going anywhere." Noah studied his father's face with those pale blue eyes, searching, weighing, deciding. Then he nodded. Just once, and that was enough. Claire was still in Asheville. She hadn't left after the article. She rented a small apartment 2 streets over, not because of Ethan, she told herself, but because for the first time in 7 years, she had found a place that felt like something close to home. On a Sunday afternoon, the 3 of them walked through the park near the river. Noah ran ahead, chasing butterflies through the tall grass, his laughter rising and falling like birdsong. Claire walked beside Ethan in comfortable silence. After a while, she asked, "Do you remember anything else from that night?" Ethan stopped walking. He looked at her. The sunlight caught the side of her face, and for a moment she looked exactly like the woman in his dream, young, afraid, reaching for someone in the dark. "I remembered one thing," he said. "Last week, I was half asleep on the sofa, and I heard it clear as a bell, like it had just happened." Claire held her breath. "I heard a woman screaming, and I heard myself say—" Claire's hand went to her mouth. Tears spilled down her cheeks, because those were the exact words, the exact voice, the same 4 words she had carried in her chest for 7 years, like a prayer she could never quite finish. Ethan reached down and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her. His palm was rough and calloused and warm. "I don't remember everything," he said. "Maybe I never will. But I know this, whatever I did that night, I'd do it again." Noah came running back through the grass, breathless and grinning. He grabbed his father's free hand and tugged. "Dad, can we get ice cream?" Ethan looked at Claire. Claire looked at Ethan. They both laughed, the quiet, surprised laugh of two people who had forgotten that life could feel this simple. "Yeah, buddy," Ethan said. "Let's go." They walked down the path together in the late afternoon light, Ethan in his white tank top and faded cargo pants, Claire beside him, Noah between them. His rucksack was back at the house. His right hand held his son's, his left hand held Claire's. The mountains rose green and steady in the distance, unchanged by anything that had happened below them, patient as only ancient things can be. Ethan Mercer didn't remember his whole past. Maybe he never would. But for the first time and longer than he could measure, he didn't need to, because the future was right here, holding his hand, asking for ice cream, walking beside him into the long, golden evening of a life that had, against all odds, begun again.